As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the cemetery, Margaret Fletcher paused at the headstone of her late husband, her heart heavy with grief. But something caught her eye, a young black girl, no older than 10, standing solemnly by her husband's grave. What could she possibly have to do with him? Margaret's discovery would unravel a story so profound it would challenge her beliefs and bring her to tears. The sun hung low in the sky, casting an amber glow over the neatly lined headstones of Rosewood Cemetery. Margaret Fletcher, dressed in a simple black coat, clutched a bouquet of white lilies in her gloved hands. Each step she took on the gravel path felt heavier than the last. As though the weight of her grief had seeped into her bones, it was her wedding anniversary, a bittersweet occasion now that her husband, Robert, was no longer by her side. The man who had been her rock, her confidant, and her best friend was gone, leaving behind only memories and the cold granite headstone that bore his name. Margaret stopped in front of his grave, her breath catching in her throat as she arranged the lilies with care. "Happy anniversary, darling," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I miss you every day." As she stood there, lost in thought, a movement out of the corner of her eye caught her attention. Turning her head slightly, Margaret noticed a small figure standing several feet away. It was a young black girl, perhaps 10 or 11 years old, wearing a faded yellow dress and holding a modest bouquet of daisies. Margaret frowned. The girl wasn't just wandering through the cemetery, she was standing directly in front of Robert's grave. For a moment, Margaret hesitated. Who was this child? Why was she here? Her curiosity quickly overshadowed her hesitation, and she cleared her throat softly to get the girl's attention. "Hello," Margaret said, her voice gentle but firm. "Can I help you?" The girl turned her head sharply, her wide brown eyes locking onto Margaret's. There was a flicker of something in her expression, fear, perhaps, or uncertainty. She clutched the daisies tightly. As though they were a lifeline. "I'm sorry," the girl mumbled, her voice barely audible. "I didn't mean to bother you." "You're not bothering me," Margaret assured her, taking a cautious step closer. "I was just wondering. Do you know Robert?" The girl hesitated, her gaze dropping to the ground. She shuffled her feet nervously, then nodded. "Yes, ma'am. He was nice to my mom. He helped us." Margaret's brow furrowed in confusion. Help them? Robert had been a kind and generous man, but he had never mentioned this to her. She searched the girl's face for more answers, but before she could ask another question, the girl abruptly turned and darted away, leaving the daisies behind. "Wait!" Margaret called out, but the girl didn't stop. Within moments, she had disappeared down the path, leaving Margaret alone once more. Her heart pounded as she stared at the daisies lying at the foot of Robert's grave. Questions swirled in her mind, each one more perplexing than the last. Who was that child? What did she mean about Robert helping her family? And why had she run away? As the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon, Margaret found herself standing there, clutching her coat tightly against the chill of the evening air. She didn't have the answers yet, but one thing was certain, this was not the end of the story, it was only the beginning. Margaret couldn't shake the encounter at the cemetery. The image of the young girl, her wide eyes filled with both innocence and an air of secrecy, haunted her. For days, Margaret replayed the moment in her mind, the girl's nervous demeanor, her whispered words about Robert helping her family, and her sudden flight. It was a puzzle Margaret felt compelled to solve, not just to satisfy her curiosity but to understand this hidden side of her late husband. One evening, sitting alone in the quiet of her living room, Margaret opened Robert's old desk. It had remained untouched since his passing, a relic of his life and work. As she sifted through papers, letters, and photographs, she realized how little she had known about the details of his day-to-day activities. Robert had always been selfless, a man who didn't talk much about his good deeds. He had simply done what he believed was right, often without fanfare. Margaret decided to take her search beyond the walls of their home. She started by visiting the community center where Robert had occasionally volunteered. The place was a modest but bustling hub of activity, with children playing in the courtyard and adults attending workshops. Inside, Margaret approached a receptionist, a middle-aged woman with a warm smile. "Excuse me," Margaret began, her voice hesitant. I'm Margaret Fletcher. My late husband, Robert, used to volunteer here. I was hoping you might be able to tell me about his time here." The receptionist's face lit up. "Oh, Mr. Fletcher. He was such a kind man. Always willing to lend a hand. Let me see if Mr. Carter is available. He ran most of the programs Robert was involved in." Moments later, an older man with a weathered face and kind eyes emerged from an office. "Mrs. Fletcher," he greeted her warmly. "It's an honor to meet you. Your husband was one of the best men I've ever known." Margaret smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "Thank you. I actually wanted to ask if you knew anything about a young girl," she said. "Robert helped her and her mother. I don't know her name, but she left flowers at his grave." Mr. Carter's expression grew thoughtful. "That sounds like Zoe. She's a sweet girl, always polite. Her mother, Tasha, used to come here a lot when she was struggling. Robert was a godsend to them." Margaret leaned forward. "Struggling how?" He sighed, his tone growing serious. "Tasha was in a bad situation, financial trouble, personal struggles. Robert took it upon himself to help her out. He paid for her to attend a job training program and even helped her find temporary housing. He didn't want anyone to know, he was very private about his acts of kindness." Margaret sat back, stunned. She had always known Robert to be generous, but this was beyond anything she had imagined. "I didn't know," she murmured. The next day, Margaret decided to visit Tasha and Zoe. With Mr. Carter's help, she found their address, a modest apartment complex on the outskirts of town. She hesitated at the door, unsure of what she would say. After a deep breath, she knocked. The door opened to reveal a woman in her early 30s, with tired eyes but a warm smile. "Mrs. Fletcher?" Tasha asked, her voice laced with surprise. "Yes," Margaret replied. "I hope I'm not intruding, but I wanted to talk to you about my husband." Tasha nodded and invited her inside. The apartment was small but tidy, with drawings by Zoe taped to the walls. As they sat down, Margaret noticed a framed photo of Robert on a side table. "Zoe keeps that there," Tasha explained, her voice thick with emotion. "Your husband meant the world to us." Margaret smiled faintly. "I didn't know the extent of what he did for you. Could you tell me more?" Tasha took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly. "I was in a bad place when I met Robert. I had just left an abusive relationship, and I didn't know how I was going to support Zoe. I came to the community center for help, and Robert was the first person to really see me. He didn't just throw money at the problem, he gave me hope. He believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself." Margaret's eyes filled with tears as she listened. "He never told me any of this," she said softly. Tasha nodded. "He didn't want recognition. He said it wasn't about him, it was about doing what was right." At that moment, Zoe walked into the room, her face lighting up when she saw Margaret. "You're Mr. Fletcher's wife," she said shyly. "Yes, I am," Margaret replied, her voice thick with emotion. "And I'm so glad to meet you." As the evening wore on, Margaret learned more about the impact Robert had on Tasha and Zoe's lives. He had helped Tasha find her footing and had become a father figure to Zoe, always encouraging her to dream big. When Margaret left that night, she felt a mixture of sadness and pride. She had lost Robert, but his legacy lived on in the lives he had touched. Standing in the quiet of the parking lot, Margaret looked up at the stars and whispered, "You were always extraordinary, Robert. Thank you for showing me just how much." Margaret couldn't stop thinking about what she had learned from Tasha and Zoe. Each new piece of information painted an image of Robert she had never fully seen before, selfless, compassionate, and quietly heroic. Yet, a part of her felt unsettled. Why had he kept all of this from her? Was it humility, or had he doubted that she would understand? The next morning, Margaret sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, staring out the window. She didn't notice her sister-in-law, and, walking in until she spoke, "You look like you've seen a ghost," and remarked, setting her purse down. Margaret shook her head. "It's not a ghost. It's Robert. Or at least, a side of him I never knew." And raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Margaret hesitated but then decided to explain everything. She told Anne about the girl at the grave, her visits to the community center, and the stories she had heard from Tasha. Anne listened intently, her face softening with each word. "That sounds just like Robert," Anne said when Margaret finished. "He was always helping people, even when we were kids. He hated the idea of anyone feeling alone or forgotten." Margaret sighed, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped her tea. "But why didn't he tell me? We shared everything, or at least, I thought we did." And reached across the table and placed a hand on Margaret's. "Maybe he didn't want to burden you with it, or maybe he thought it wasn't about him. Robert was the kind of man who believed in doing good for its own sake." Determined to find closure, Margaret returned to Robert's grave that evening. She carried a bouquet of flowers, but this time, they weren't just for him, they were for Zoe as well. To her surprise, the girl was already there, sitting cross-legged near the headstone with a small notebook in her lap. She seemed lost in thought, her pencil scratching against the paper. Margaret approached slowly, not wanting to startle her. "Hello again, Zoe," she said softly. Zoe looked up, her eyes wide with recognition. "Mrs. Fletcher," she said, quickly closing the notebook. Margaret smiled and sat down beside her. "You don't have to run away this time," she said gently. Zoe's cheeks flushed with embarrassment. "I'm sorry about before. I didn't mean to be rude." "You weren't rude," Margaret assured her. "You were just surprised." "I was, too." They sat in silence for a moment, the cool evening breeze rustling the leaves around them. Finally, Margaret spoke again. "Zoe, I want you to know how much it means to me that you've been visiting Robert. He clearly cared about you and your mother a great deal." Zoe nodded, her eyes glistening. "He did. He told me to never give up. No matter what. He said I was smart and that I could do anything I wanted if I worked hard." Margaret's heart ached as she listened. "What are you writing?" she asked, nodding toward the notebook. Zoe hesitated, then opened the book to reveal a collection of short poems and drawings. "It's for him," she said quietly. "I write things I wish I could tell him. Things I miss." Margaret blinked back tears. "That's beautiful, Zoe. I think he would have loved it." In the weeks that followed, Margaret found herself spending more time with Tasha and Zoe. She invited them over for dinner, attended Zoe's school events, and even helped Tasha with her job applications. Their shared connection to Robert created a bond that transcended race, age, and background. One evening, as they sat together on Margaret's porch, Zoe asked a question that caught her off guard. "Do you think Mr. Fletcher knew how much he mattered to us?" Margaret paused, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "I think he did, Zoe. But knowing you're here, remembering him and all he did, that would have meant the world to him." For the first time in months, Margaret felt a sense of peace. Robert's legacy wasn't just in the memories she cherished, it was alive in the lives he had touched and in the new connections she was building. Margaret awoke with a renewed sense of purpose. Her encounters with Tasha and Zoe had sparked something deep within her, a need to continue Robert's legacy. He had made a difference quietly, and now it was her turn to step forward, not just as his widow but as someone who believed in the values he had lived by. Her first step was returning to the community center. This time, she wasn't there to ask questions but to offer her help. Mr. Carter was surprised but delighted to see her again. "Mrs. Fletcher," he said warmly, shaking her hand. "What brings you back?" Margaret smiled. "Call me Margaret. And I'm here because I want to get involved. Robert gave so much of himself to this place. I want to continue what he started." Mr. Carter nodded, his eyes glistening with gratitude. "We could always use more hands. Let me show you around." Margaret quickly found herself immersed in the work. She organized events, assisted with fundraising efforts, and even began mentoring some of the younger children at the center. It was hard work, but it was fulfilling in a way she hadn't expected. One afternoon, as she was helping sort donations, she spotted Zoe in the crowd. The girl was with a group of children, laughing and playing. Margaret waved, and Zoe ran over to her, beaming. "Hi, Mrs. Fletcher." Zoe said, hugging her tightly. "Hi, Zoe," Margaret replied, her heart swelling with affection. "What are you doing here?" "I come here after school sometimes," Zoe explained. "Mom says it's good for me to be around other kids." Margaret crouched down to meet Zoe's eyes. "I think she's right. And you know what? I'm glad I get to see you here." Zoe grinned. "Me too." As Margaret delved deeper into the work, she uncovered more stories about Robert's time at the center. Staff and volunteers spoke of how he had gone above and beyond, often stepping in where others hesitated. He had paid for groceries, covered medical bills, and even helped repair the center's leaky roof, all without ever seeking recognition. One story, in particular, stood out. A young man named Jamal approached Margaret during an event and introduced himself. "Mrs. Fletcher," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "I don't know if you know this, but your husband saved my life." Margaret looked at him, startled. "What do you mean?" Jamal took a deep breath. "I was in a really bad place a few years ago. I had dropped out of school, and I was getting into trouble. Mr. Fletcher didn't lecture me or judge me. He just listened. And then he helped me get a GED and even lined up my first job. I'm in college now because of him." Tears welled in Margaret's eyes. "Thank you for telling me that," she said, her voice trembling. Jamal smiled. "No, ma'am. Thank you for sharing him with us." Margaret began to see how Robert's kindness had created a ripple effect, touching lives and inspiring others to do the same. Tasha, now working full-time and thriving, volunteered her time at the center. Jamal became a mentor to other young men in the community. And Zoe, with her endless curiosity and creativity, started helping Margaret with small tasks, eager to give back in her own way. One evening, Margaret hosted a small gathering at her home to celebrate the community center's accomplishments. As she looked around the room, at Tasha and Zoe, Mr. Carter, Jamal, and the many others who had been impacted by Robert, she felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. "Thank you all for being here," she said, raising her glass. "Robert may no longer be with us, but his spirit lives on in each of you. Together, we can honor his memory by continuing to help and uplift one another." The room erupted in applause, and Margaret knew she was exactly where she needed to be. The transformation in Margaret's life was undeniable. Once confined to her quiet routines, she was now deeply embedded in a vibrant community where she found purpose and connection. The bond she formed with Tasha, Zoe, and the others at the community center filled a void she hadn't realized was there, even during her years with Robert. One sunny afternoon, Margaret found herself sitting on a park bench with Tasha, watching Zoe play on the swings. They had become fast friends, often spending time together outside of the center. "You know," Tasha said, her voice soft but firm, "when I first saw you at the grave, I thought you were going to judge us. I thought maybe you wouldn't want to know about Zoe or me." Margaret looked at her, surprised. "Why would you think that?" Tasha shrugged, a faint smile playing on her lips. "It's not always easy, you know. Being a black woman in this world, raising a child on my own. People assume things. I thought maybe you'd see us as a burden, not a part of Robert's legacy." Margaret reached over and placed a hand on Tasha's. "I can't pretend to understand all of what you've been through, but I know this: Robert cared about you and Zoe deeply. And now, so do I. You're not a burden. You're family." Tasha's eyes glistened, and she nodded. "Thank you, Margaret. That means more than you know." Zoe's school was hosting a talent show, and she had signed up to perform a spoken word poem she had written. It was a tribute to Robert, a heartfelt piece that captured his kindness, wisdom, and the impact he had on her life. The auditorium buzzed with excitement as parents and students filled the seats. Margaret and Tasha sat together in the front row, their eyes fixed on the stage. When Zoe's name was called, she walked out confidently, her notebook clutched tightly in her hands. "Hi, everyone," she began, her voice steady despite the crowd. "This poem is called A Friend Like No Other. It's about someone who believed in me when I didn't believe in myself." As Zoe recited her poem, Margaret felt tears streaming down her face. The words were raw and honest, painting a vivid picture of the man she had loved and the difference he had made in the lives of those around him. When Zoe finished, the audience erupted in applause. She smiled shyly and looked toward Margaret and Tasha, who stood clapping, their pride evident. After the talent show, Margaret and Tasha walked Zoe back to Margaret's house for a small celebration. They had invited a few friends from the community center, and the evening was filled with laughter, food, and stories about Robert. As the night wore on, Margaret pulled Zoe aside. "I want you to have something," she said. Handing the girl a small wooden box, Zoe opened it to find a watch with a leather strap, its face slightly worn but still gleaming. "This was Robert's," Margaret explained. "He wore it every day. I think he'd want you to have it." Zoe's eyes widened. "Are you sure?" Margaret nodded, smiling. "I'm sure. He would be so proud of you, Zoe." "And so am I." Zoe hugged Margaret tightly, her voice trembling as she said, "Thank you, Mrs. Fletcher. I'll take good care of it." Over time, Margaret's efforts at the community center grew into a larger movement. She organized mentorship programs, secured funding for renovations, and worked to expand the center's reach. Her journey had started with a sense of loss, but it had led her to a newfound purpose and a deep understanding of what it meant to truly live a life of compassion. At the center's annual fundraiser, Margaret stood before a packed room, her heart full as she addressed the crowd. "When I first came here, I was searching for answers about my husband," she began. "What I found was a community that showed me the true depth of his character. Robert believed in lifting others up, and now, thanks to all of you, his legacy will continue for generations to come." The room erupted in applause, and Margaret felt a wave of warmth and gratitude. She had found a new family, one built not by blood but by shared values and a commitment to making the world a better place. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like, comment, and subscribe to our channel. Share your thoughts about Margaret's journey, Robert's incredible legacy, or the power of community in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss another story that inspires, uplifts, and reminds us of the beauty of human connection. Let's spread this message of hope and compassion by sharing this video with your friends and family. Together, we can continue to build bridges and create a legacy of kindness that lasts for generations.